Hello and welcome to JavaScript Marathon, a full week of free online courses in some of the leading web development technologies and concepts. Today's trainer is Nic Steenhout, web accessibility advocate and developer. He will be presenting the meaning of web accessibility, accessible HTML, and assistive technologies. If you have any questions after today, feel free to follow Nic at Vavroom. Special thanks to this week's sponsor, This.Labs, offering personalized training programs to suit your organizational needs, ensuring you and your company stay on the leading edge. If you find keeping up with constantly evolving technologies a struggle and want to bring your team up to speed on one of the latest technologies, contact us today at hi@thisdot.co to set up your complimentary needs assessment. This.Labs is hiring. If you're interested in an engineering manager role or a senior software engineer role, please send us your info at jobs@thisdot.co. You can also see a full list of all openings at thisdot.co/jobs. We have a ton of upcoming events happening next month, including State of GraphQL, State of Angular, our Women in Tech monthly mentoring, and Modern Web State of Microservices. Angular World Tour continues in Athens and Memphis, and stay tuned for the release of React World Tour. And JavaScript Marathon is back November 15th through the 19th. Stay tuned at javascriptmarathon.com for more information. And with that, I will turn it over to Nic.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this JavaScript Marathon. Today, we have Nic Steenhout, who is going to be giving a really amazing training on accessibility. Welcome, Nic.
Well, thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of ground to cover, and maybe I'll just jump right in. I'll talk to who I am in a second, but the first thing I want to say is my presentations are not spectator sports. So feel free to interrupt if you have questions, if you have comments, if anything makes sense to you and you go, oh, yes, I can relate to this, interject and participate. This is really important for this context. So let's start at the start. I'm going to cover a lot of baselines, some things you may be familiar with, some things you may not be familiar with, but the idea is to make sure that we're all on the same, we all have the same foundations to get started. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get you to tell me a little bit about this set of stairs. For those of you who don't have the ability to see, the stairs on the slides here is a long flight of stairs coming out of a subway, and there's several different aspects to the stairs. And my question to the audience is, what if I told you that these stairs are accessible? What would you say? And this is where you folks start telling me what you think about these.
That does not make it
accessible.
Yeah.
So I have a few that is not accessible. I have one, I think, that is not wheelchair accessible. So let's explore that. If it's not wheelchair accessible, is it actually accessible?
I can tell you it's not accessible when I'm trying to bring 50 pounds of luggage up the stairs.
Well, here's your problem, Tracy. 50 pounds of luggage. You should travel lighter than that.
It's just a day trip, Tracy. What are you doing?
Seriously, though, the fact of the matter, these stairs are technically classified as accessible stairs under the Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility guidelines. Now, this has nothing to do with the web, with the kind of work we're doing, but it's important to understand that accessibility, we can implement a lot of accessibility into what we're building, even if we think we can't make things fully 100% accessible to everybody. So obviously, these stairs are difficult for me as a wheelchair user to navigate, but there's a whole bunch of features that are really cool about these stairs that make them accessible. The first thing is you'll notice on each side of the stairs, there's a continuous handrail. Even when there's a change of level, the handrails don't stop. This means that somebody who needs balance is able to use the handrails all the way up. Somebody who can't see is able to tell just by the way the handrail changes where there's a change of level, where the stairs stops, where they end. Talking of change of level, in the middle of the stairs, there's a large flat area, and this is good for people to be able to put their 50-pound luggage down, take a breath, and stop. But also people that maybe don't have stamina or don't have the strength to do the whole flight of steps in one go. There's also visible contrasting strips at the edge of each stair. So someone who has low vision may actually be able to tell where each step ends and begins. The risers, that is the vertical part of each steps, is filled. This means someone using a crutch or a cane is not likely to have their mobility implements slip through and break. Same thing with a guide dog. So there's a whole bunch of relatively small features to these stairs that mean that they are accessible for a whole bunch of people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep. I do need you to interact verbally because I can't easily see your screens, your cameras. So if I ask a question and you want to say yes, don't just nod or shake your head. I will need you to interact verbally. That said, as I said, this is not a spectator sport. We will be asking the audience quite a bit about what they think, their experience, and your knowledge. So a little bit about me. I'm Nic Steenhout. I have been doing accessibility for over 20 years by now. I've been around the block a few times. I've been a member of the W3C working group, education and outreach in terms of the accessibility guidelines. I'm an independent consultant doing a lot of accessibility work, obviously. And I'm also doing a podcast about accessibility called The Accessibility Rules. You can find it at a11yrules.com. I happen to be on Twitter at Vavroom, Vavroom. I tweet a lot, but I welcome any questions out there. First, a disclaimer. We have a limited amount of time. I can't teach you everything there is to know about accessibility in the limited time that we have. But it's going to get you started. It's going to hopefully give you a little bit of passion and interest and desire to dig more. And it should give you the tools to know where to go to find more information. It's going to help you create a workflow to find, identify, and rectify a majority of issues. Everybody so far with me?
Yes.
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 Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So let me tell you a story. I'm a wheelchair user, and I have a mobility assistance dog. And a few years ago, I was going down the street. It was a sunny day. I had my wraparound dark sunglasses, and my dog was pulling me. He just loves working and pulling. It's great fun. But we were going by a little outdoor patio, and a couple of people were talking together, and they were talking just loud enough that as I went by, I could hear them. And they said, one of them said, "Oh, isn't it sad? He's blind and in a wheelchair." So of course I stopped. I turned around and I say, yeah, but I'm not deaf. The thing is, you don't know that you don't know things. Most people see a service dog and they think guide dogs. They don't realize there's mobility assistance dogs, there's hearing dogs, there's seizure dogs. There's a whole range of services that dogs can provide for disabled people. And in your journey to accessibility, it's okay to realize that there are things you don't know. And it's even all right to realize that there are a bunch of things you don't even know that you have to know about them. So I'm really hard on people that don't do the right thing from an accessibility perspective when I know that they know. But don't be hard on yourself, because you're learning. You're on your journey to discover more accessibility. And maybe by the end of this presentation, you'll feel like an accessibility champion, and that's going to be great. Maybe you're going to be the squeaky wheel that keeps saying, hey, what about accessibility? And that's great. And it's also okay to realize I can't know everything there is to know. I've been doing this for over 2 decades and I'm still learning, and things are changing. So it's okay to evolve your things. One of the things you're going to discover, probably if you're around social media, particularly Twitter, is you're going to see the A11Y used instead of accessibility. You already saw it when I was talking about my podcast, the accessibility rules. Does anyone know what A11Y is, why it came to be, and what it means?
Oh, I do.
Okay, go for it.
Twitter has a restriction on the length of the tweet, so people came up with this: that the first letter, the last letter, and the number of letters between them. So that's accessibility.
That's exactly right. This is a numeronym. It began on Twitter because of the character restriction. When this came out, it was 140 characters on Twitter, so it was even more limited. There was a lot of people that are saying, well, the A11Y numeronym is not accessible. It's very jargon. And yes, it is. But at the same time, it's been around for a long time now, and it is part of the dev culture. There are other numeronyms that are used, like internationalization is I18N. There's a whole range of numeronym that we use a lot in development, so this should not be too unfamiliar to you. We're talking about web accessibility specifically, and I'm going to give you a definition, and this is one of many ways to look at accessibility. One of the questions that I ask my guest on the podcast all the time is, how do you define web accessibility? And I've had about 70 different guests, and out of 70 different guests, I've had about 70 different answers. Some of them are slightly more different than others, but in general, we're talking about the inclusive practice of building websites usable by everyone, regardless of their level of ability or disability. So there are some important parts here. The inclusive practice, we're talking about inclusion. We're talking about inclusive design as the overarching way to look at it. We're not looking specifically at the nitty-gritty of accessibility, even though that's what we're talking about. We want things to be usable by everyone, whether they have a disability or not. Obviously, the primary audience, the primary target for the work we're doing with accessibility are disabled people. But as we'll talk a little bit about later, a lot of what we do is good for everyone. So let's talk about who is accessibility for? Well, primarily we're talking about 4 main disability groups. We're talking about people with hearing impairments, whether they are deaf or hard of hearing. We're talking about people with vision disabilities, whether they are blind, legally blind, have low vision. There's a whole range there. We're also talking about people with physical impairments, whether we're talking about someone who's had a stroke and is paralyzed on one side of their body, or maybe someone had cerebral palsy, or maybe they're paralyzed. They were playing rugby or football when they were a teenager and they got tackled and they broke their neck. So there's a whole range there. And then we're also talking about people with cognitive impairments. And there's a wide range there. We're talking about, well, maybe someone had a brain injury. We're talking about maybe a learning impairment like dyslexia, or maybe someone has chronic fatigue, or maybe we're getting a growing segment of the population that had COVID and they now have long COVID, and part of that includes fatigue, includes brain fog, so it's hard to concentrate and perceive things. So we have to consider all these groups, all these target groups. We're also talking about all devices. So we're talking about laptop, desktops, tablets, phones. We're also talking about other devices that we may not be as familiar with. For example, there's Braille and Speak devices, which are computer designed for folks who are blind. The keyboard is different. There's no screen, and either the output is through audio or it's through a refreshable Braille display. A Braille display is basically a series of dots that can go up and down depending on which Braille character is needed to be displayed. So far, so good?
Yes.
So far, so good. Yep.
Yep. Excellent.
Cool. So part of the accessibility work we do involves a lot of assistive technologies, and probably one you have heard about is screen readers. Screen readers are devices, not devices, it's software that helps folks who are blind navigate their computer, open application, create files, save files, and so on and so forth. But also in our context, specifically interact with the content on our web apps, web pages, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go in depth into screen readers because that's a whole other ballgame, but it's important to understand it's there. It's also important to understand that accessibility is not just about screen readers. There's a whole other bunch of things we can do that's around that. One assistive technology that you probably use every day and you may not have thought about that is an assistive technology is the keyboard. The keyboard today is probably one of the biggest accessibility features used by just about every screen reader users, sorry. But a funny bit of trivia is the keyboard was invented to help deaf people communicate in writing faster with hearing people way back in the 1850s. So in the last 175 years or so, there's been about 50 major revisions to what the keyboard looks like. And we are where we're at now with the keyboard that we love and use every day. We have people that are using speech input, whether it's Dragon Naturally Speaking or it's people interacting with your web app through their smart speakers. We have to consider people using speech input for that. We have people that are using sip and puff switches. You may remember Christopher Reeves, when he was paralyzed, he was controlling his wheelchair with a straw. And depending on how he puffed into it or sipped into it, he could go forward, stop, turn, and so on and so forth. But he could also control his computer that way. So that is one way to actually interact with your application that maybe you haven't considered before. But if someone is relying on an on-screen keyboard using a series of sips and puffs to move from one letter to another and then select which letter to write into the input, and you don't give enough time to fill in the form, well, it's going to take a lot longer for these people to actually be able to interact with your forms. We also have eye gaze technology. So you have a camera at the top of your computer that looks at your eyes, and you may have even a small pointer on your forehead that helps with that. So it looks whether you're looking on screen, and depending on how you're blinking your eyes, it will create different mouse events. So there's a lot of complication, and technology is just wonderful in terms of helping disabled people be more independent. It's our job to make sure that we build things that are going to work for everybody. Disability, what is it? Well, there's a whole bunch of definitions around that. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's really 3 prongs of it. One is a condition that significantly affects one or more activity of daily living. We're talking about seeing, hearing, walking, eating, and there's a whole list. Someone may have a history of such a condition, or someone may be perceived as having such a condition. That 3rd prong is more important in day-to-day meet space accessibility because they may be refused access to somewhere because they think they have a disability or whatever. But what we're talking about for us is a condition that significantly affects one or more activity of daily living. It's important to think that in terms of the work we do, it doesn't matter if someone has a diagnosis of having a disability. It doesn't even matter if someone self-identifies as being disabled. The moment they have a barrier is the moment they become disabled. So out of curiosity, who can tell me more or less how many disabled people are in the United States right now?
Hundreds of millions.
Hundreds of millions. Okay, let's rephrase that. In terms of percentage, what's the percentage of people with disabilities in the US population?
40%.
Oh, yeah, y'all spoke over each other one at a time. Did I say 30%? Did I hear 30?
I said 20. Oh, sorry.
You 20, 80. I said 80.
80%. 80 is a bit high. 20 is a bit low. At the last information released by the CDC, we are looking at 26% of people with disabilities. That's about 1 person in 4. We are the largest minority group on the web. And I don't know if any of you watch America's Got Talent, but there's a great comedian that's been making the round, Josh Blue, and he made the joke that not only are we the largest minority group on the web, but we're also the only minority group that you can join at any time. You don't know if you're going to be disabled tomorrow. So it's not a insignificant number. Oops. I have been missing the chat. Cool. So we also have this idea of temporary impairments. Temporary impairments could be you're breaking a limb, like me. A few years ago, I broke both wrists at more or less the same time. The first wrist I broke was falling off an icy sidewalk in Montreal. I came home, my wife kind of laughed at me good-heartedly. She wasn't making fun of me, but she said, "Oh, well, you're going to go round and round in circle now that you have a broken wrist and an arm in a cast. It's going to be hard to push your wheelchair." So 2 weeks later, after a car accident where a drunk driver ran into me, I broke my other wrist. So I went home and I said, well, I can push my wheelchair straight now. Thing is, I'm typing 80 words per minute, right? With 2 arms and thumbs in casts, I became a sighted keyboard-only user, and it was really hard to type with 2 fingers. So I went from that to trying to do speech input, and I was using a Mac, and at the time in 2015, the speech input features on the Mac were not really good. So I became even more disabled than I am. The other segment of population that we want to talk about is folks that have situational impairments. So maybe someone has a baby, the baby is sick, and they're worried about the baby, and the only way to access information is on the web, on their mobile phone, and they're not going to be able to focus 100% on whatever is going on the phone because their mind is split, trying to find information and caring for the baby at the same time. So we have to make sure what we're doing is easy to use, clear to understand for everyone. Now, there is a philosophy out there that says people aren't disabled, or they only become disabled when their environment disables them, like wheelchair user that can't get into a building because of a long flight of stairs. The disability is not the fact that they use wheelchair. The disability is that the building is not accessible. When we're looking at web or digital application, it's the same thing. If we build it correctly, disabled folks will be able to be fully independent and use our stuff. So we don't want to disable our users. In terms of metrics, there's no metrics out there. There's no way to track who uses a screen reader to come to our website. We don't know if someone is colorblind. We don't know a whole number of things about our users in terms of disability, the way we would know what browser they use, what language their operating system's at, where they come from, all that stuff. But I will tell you this. If one of your client insists on servicing IE11, I guarantee you that the number of people using IE11 compared to the number of people with disabilities coming to the site in general, you're going to spend a lot of time servicing IE11 and not disability, and that does not compute to me. One thing a lot of people say to me is, accessibility is so hard, it's such a chore. And at the same time, I have all these developers who say to me, hey, I love me a good coding challenge. So if you're thinking accessibility is hard and accessibility is a chore, I'm going to suggest switch your thinking. Start thinking in terms of it's a technical challenge and it's actually really cool to find solutions that work for everyone. Now, I've been focusing a lot on disabled people. I will say that barriers aren't just for people with disabilities. We're not just talking about disabled people. We're also talking about you. For example, if you have a website that has low contrast, it's using gray text on gray background, it's going to be really hard to see for disabled folks that have low vision. It's also going to be really hard to see for you on your mobile device when you're outside in full sun. If we're looking at content that is written in really complex, hard to understand language, it's going to be a problem for people with cognitive impairment. Maybe it's going to be a problem for people with dyslexia. But it's also going to be difficult for a whole bunch of people that come to your website for whom English is not their first language. So we have to keep thinking we're doing accessibility work for people with disabilities, but we're also doing accessibility work for everyone to make our stuff more usable, more user-friendly. Quick note, you will hear me talk about people with disabilities and you'll hear me talk about disabled people. And you may think, what's the right way to refer to those people? Well, until very recently, the appropriate language was people with disabilities from that perspective of people first language. So I'm not, I am a wheelchair user. I am a person who uses a wheelchair because it's not defining me entirely. But more and more and more, the disability population community is pushing back and they're saying, well, actually, I'm disabled. It is only a part of who I am, but it is a part of me that can't be taken away. And they're reclaiming this word of being disabled. So it becomes identity first rather than people first language. It's okay to use both. Just saying that in passing. So I've gone through really quickly through a whole bunch of information about disability and accessibility and who it's for and what it's for. I'd love to hear very briefly if there's anything that really stuck to your mind or anything that surprised you in what we talked about.
We'll say one of the things that I've always liked the most and that you mentioned is the mindset of a disability or hardship doesn't have to be permanent for it to affect you. Like having the temporary impairments of like having your arms full or being outside in sunlight is also a really good consideration for why you should work to make your things as accessible and inclusive as you can.
Fantastic. Thank you. Anybody else want to share anything about what we spoke about so far? Don't be shy.
So I believe that a big part of the accessibility efforts that you can make, not only in the web, but also in your social life, if you are, for example, claiming that something in the infrastructure of the city is not accessible for everyone. I think that the most important part there, and is I recognize my lack of culture about the topic, is the whole amount of types of disabilities that and how that will affect the different aspects. For example, sometimes you give things for granted, like the traffic signs, and you sometimes don't realize that might be that traffic signs hard to read for someone that is not completely blind. So, and moving that to the web is kind of the same. I think that is really important to know what are the different kinds of disability that can be present when dealing with the web. So I would love to. I have already learned about that right now until now, but I would love to hear more about that.
Excellent. Yes, there are certainly a lot of different conditions that affect how people interact with computers and how people interact with the web. And the more we discover things, the more we realize that, well, maybe what we've been doing isn't quite enough. I will plug my podcast again. There's a series called the Accessibility Sound Bytes. It's a series of short podcasts. It's 5 to 10 minutes each. You can find it under the menu item Sound Bytes if you go to a11yrules.com. And that series is disabled people talking about their condition and talking about what barriers they encounter on the web. And I think it's really powerful for those of us who aren't familiar with some conditions to really hear it in the words of the person themselves, why it's a problem, and how can we make it easier for them to interact with our products. So that would be something to explore if you want. And of course, we're not going to have time to cover all that, but hit me up on Twitter, Vevroom, VAVROOM, and I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about that.
Excellent, thank you.
So let's talk about WCAG, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. First thing I would like to specify about WCAG is that this is not the target. WCAG is the baseline. It's the very minimum we should do to make things accessible. It's a great start and it's full of information, but it's not the be-all and end-all of accessibility. It's also written by a whole bunch of really good folks. There's about 35, 40 people on the working group that are creating the guidelines, but it's 35, 40 people that have their own strong ideas and experience and we have to reach consensus when we're creating guidelines. So some things are not always 100% what everybody would like to see. So let's keep that in mind. Now, one of the things about WCAG or WCAG is it's version controlled, basically. So we're currently at version 2.1, but before the end of the year, all going well, we'll be at version 2.2. Version 2.2 does not supersede all of 2.1. It just adds things to it. When we're talking about the guidelines about WCAG, we're looking at different levels. So we maybe heard WCAG 2.1 AA or A or AAA. So A is the bare minimum you need to do to make things usable. AA, it provides good access, and AAA is the target that you want to accomplish if possible. But it's in 99% of the cases, it's not going to be possible for you to reach all of AAA. So really your focus of attention really should be to make sure everything is WCAG 2.1 AA conformant at the moment. But when things change, when the version changes, we want to look at improving that. So we're talking about 3 levels. There's 4 principles. These principles are broken into 12 different rules, and each of these rules are broken into success criteria, and at the moment we have 78 of them. I don't know all that by heart. I would not expect you to know all that by heart, but if you can remember the 3 levels, the 4 principles, and the 12 rules, that's going to be fantastic. On top of all that, there's also a whole bunch of techniques on the W3C website that are going to help you understand each success criteria, what it means, and how to implement it. So the 4 principles of accessibility, we're talking about perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And you can remember that fairly easily with the acronym POUR. So you pour on WCAG, POUR, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable means whatever is there on the screen can be perceived. It can be seen. It can be known it's there. Operable means that someone can interact with the element that are meant to be interacted with, whether it's a button, a link, a form, or whatever. Understandable, well, it needs to be understood. So we know it's there, we can perceive it, we can interact with it, but we also need to understand, well, what is it? What does it mean? What does it do? And finally, robust. It must be done in a way that is not only available on the most cutting nightly version of your beta release of a browser, because that doesn't work. We have a lot of disabled people that are stuck using old tech because of cost or whatever other reason. We also have people that are using very slow internet. In Canada, officially, according to the Canadian government, high-speed internet is 5 megabit per second. And we don't have all the population that has access to this so-called high-speed internet. So when you're building something, keep in mind that not everybody is on 800 megabit per second connection. So actually, I had someone that was telling me they work at Google, they live 11 miles away from the Google headquarters in California, and they have to use satellite access because that's the only way they have to use. And with satellite access, they're lucky if they're getting 2 megabit per second with ping times of anywhere up to 1200 millisecond pings. So that makes it really hard. So that's where building robust applications, robust pages is super critical. Right, so beware, compliance does not mean it's accessible. Here's a curb cut I saw in Chicago a while back. This curb cut is 100% compliant to the ADA accessibility guidelines. It's the right gradient. There's a texture strip at the bottom of it, so someone with cane that is blind will know where the sidewalk ends and the street starts. The side of the ramp are filled so a wheelchair can't fall off it. It's 100% compliant, but because it doesn't go anywhere and there's two large poles right on top of the curb ramp, it means it's not accessible. And we have to be careful not to make this happen when we're building things. We have to look at the whole rather than focus individually on each item. Accessibility is not black and white. It can vary. If I do an audit and I look at something, I'm going to say a fail is a fail is a fail. If you're not meeting a success criteria for the purpose of an audit, you're not meeting it. It's a fail. But you may ask yourself which disability is more important. Do you need to make sure that something is written in really plain language, but then that makes the information maybe more diluted? Is it something, sometimes you have to make sure that the tables are adjustable and sortable and flexible, but how does that work with screen reader users when you're truncating text? So there's a whole bunch of questions you have to ask yourself. Starting to get into the nitty-gritty of actual accessibility, there's 3 areas that you should remember. It's keyboard, images, and forms, KIF. With these 3 elements, you can really make your application accessible to most people. I would also throw contrast. Color contrast is a big thing, but it doesn't sound good. KIF, KIFK. Yeah, let's call it KIFK. And also remember the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, Level A, the principle POUR, perceivable, operable, and robust. So let's look at HTML. I learned HTML a long time ago, and I was writing HTML in Notepad a long time ago. The fact of the matter is, HTML, whether we're using JavaScript, whether we're using Vue, React, whatever, HTML is what gets pushed to the browser, and it's what the browser uses to render anything in terms of visuals and content. It's also what is used by assistive technologies to interact with things. So often a screen reader will interact with the HTML, bypassing what the browser actually displays. Now, here's food for thought. The average 5-year-old knows about 300 words of their own language. There's about 115 important HTML tags. So I'm going to say learn HTML. And I'm going to actually do a bit of a quiz time with you. Let's see how many HTML tags we can think of without looking it up. Ideally, you might be able to cheat, but let's go see how many HTML tags you can come up with. So I'm going to type them as you tell them to me. Who wants to give us a tag first?
Section.
Section. Okay, next.
Article.
Article. Next.
Main.
Nav.
Main. What was the other one?
Nav.
Nav, yes.
Title.
Title, yes.
Header.
Header, yes.
Paragraph.
Paragraph, yes.
Summary.
Side.
Summary. Was it aside, you said?
I think that's a tag, yes.
Okay, let's try it. Yep.
Time.
I didn't hear that.
Time.
Time. Yep.
Videos.
Sorry, one at a time.
Details.
Video. Yep.
Anchor.
Anchor. I'm going to write it this way. Yep.
Image.
Footer.
Image. And what was the other one?
Footer.
Footer. Yep.
Span.
Span.
Arc.
Div.
Div.
Label.
Label. Yep.
Strong.
I didn't hear that.
Strong.
Still breaking up. Can you spell it?
Strong.
Strong. Yes.
Input.
Details.
Video. And that's been
Input.
input.
I heard detail.
Details, yeah.
What was that?
Details.
Details.
And
Yep.
summary.
Summary we have already.
Then I.
SVG.
SVG.
EM.
EM.
Path.
What's that?
Path. PATH.
Path. Yes.
Marquee.
Marquee.
My favorite.
I'm gonna kill you. I'm going to kick you out of this training. Yes, marquee is actually one that is correct. I need to type it properly.
2 E's. Yeah.
It's actually not accepting it, probably because it's been deprecated, but browsers still use it. Anyway, we've done what? We've found 23. We're a group of about 20 people, and we've got 23 in a few minutes. I'm not going to keep going, but we could just go through and try and find all the HTML stuff that we can think of. Knowing HTML is actually not that difficult. Knowing the tags, where it becomes difficult is knowing how to use the tags. How do we use these things? And there's a little bit of more knowing, where do you use a button, or where do you use a div, or what do you use? And we'll talk a little bit about that in what we're doing next. So when we're looking at keyboard, there's a few things. First, there's keyboard navigation. We need to be able to get through every single element forwards and backwards using only the keyboard. This is important for screen reader users, but it's also important for sighted keyboard users, which means it's not only about moving around the page, but you have to know where you are on the page. Visible focus becomes really critical. One of the things we want to make sure when we have keyboard navigation is the idea of a skip link. I'll talk more about that, but it's dropping an idea here for you. Is your focus visible? When you're navigating through the page, can you see where your focus is? Are there any keyboard traps? So are there places where you're going through and you're not able to tab forward? Or are there places where you're able to go forward, but then suddenly when you try to go backwards, your keyboard is trapped? Incidentally, the only place it's okay for you to specifically trap the keyboard is in a modal dialog. You want to keep the focus on the modal as long as the user has that open, because if you start having to figure out where your keyboard at and you have the modal that's visibly on top of the page, but your keyboard, your focus is somewhere underneath that modal, it becomes really problematic. We want to make sure that all interactive element, buttons, links, form items, everything can be reached and interacted with the keyboard. When we're talking about focus visible, the first thing to remember is don't remove the default browser outline. So don't do in CSS outline none or outline 0. That is probably one of the best thing you can do. Go in your code and remove all that. If you're using outline none or outline 0, just do a search and replace and remove it from all your CSS. Right there, you've improved keyboard accessibility really easily. What is a little bit trickier is to ensure that you have specific visible focus. It's a good idea to define something that is specifically visible, that does not rely only on the typically Brew browser outline. Now, I had a designer tell me, but that's so ugly. And be that as it may, maybe it's ugly, but it's accessible. And ultimately, the idea is not that your site should look good, but that your site should be usable. If it looks good as well, then that's a bonus. The other thing that this designer did, we worked together for a while, but after a while, he finally stopped saying, I'm not going to use the default browser outline. What he's did instead is he designed the background color of his application to be the exact same shade of blue that the default browser outline in Chrome was, because he still found it ugly, and it meant that, well, if you don't see it, then it's not a problem. So obviously, don't be that person. We're looking about navigation, design, skip links. Skip links are these element at the top of a page. It should be the first interactive element on your page that allows you to bypass large segment of navigation. So maybe someone knows your page really well and they don't want to have to tab 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Or maybe in the case of newspapers, I had an audit on the newspaper. They had 157 tab stops between the top of the page and the first main content. That's really tiring. So design skip links. Here's an example, for example, on Starbucks. They may have changed it. That was a couple of years ago. This skip to main content allows the bypass of the logo, of all the nav and everything. And the nice thing about that is, from a design perspective, the skip to the main content only appears when it receives focus. So it doesn't, quote unquote, pollute the visual interface, but it's there when people need it. Now, keyboard navigation. Who knows how to navigate and interact with a page using the keyboard? What are the keys that you're going to use?
Tab, Shift, Tab.
Tab and Shift, Tab, yes. So
Space
Tab to go forward, Shift, Tab, Enter, and Spacebar. You can use arrows in some circumstances, but really when you're really focusing on keyboard navigation, you're looking at Tab, Shift, Tab, Enter, and Spacebar. If you happen to be testing in Safari on a Mac and you haven't changed your default, you're going to use Option Tab or Option Shift Tab because they have a weird setting that means that you can't get to all interactive elements using only Tab or Shift Tab. I'm going to give you a challenge. At some point this week, spend a day without using your mouse or trackpad. Just navigate through everything you do using only the keyboard. And then send me a tweet and tell me, hey, Nick, this is what I found. This is how I felt. I might actually switch that to spend an hour without using your mouse or trackpad, because an hour might be enough to give you an idea of how things are. Keyboard is really critical, and it can be very frustrating. Do your part and make sure it works with keyboard. And once you've done that, challenge your friends, challenge your colleagues, send them to nomouse.org and have a play with that. So that's the nutshell of keyboard. Let's talk about images a little bit. Actually, before I talk about images, any questions, concerns, things about keyboard we want to talk about?
No particular keyboard, but I remember what you were mentioning, your story with the designer, and I was thinking how important is that the foundation of the accessible web came from the design. So how important are the designers for making a smart solution for us, the developers, to also came to that? Because if you're working in a project that have design behind your kind of tag, you have to comply with that design. And if that design wasn't thought with accessibility in mind, it's a bit hard sometimes to tweak around. So I think this is really a good effort from both sides of the
designers have definitely a huge part to play in making sure something is accessible. And I would even go as far as saying that designers need to learn a basic of HTML, and when they're creating designs, they have to tell developers a little bit about what their intent was, because otherwise it's like they give you a photo of a cake and tell you bake this, and without specific instructions, you're going to come up with anything except what they really had in mind. Developing things would be a lot easier if designers were a lot more technical about how they want things to be implemented. Let's talk about images. We like to say an image is worth 1,000 words, but when you start losing your vision, what's the image worth really? And if you have an image on the web and it's important and there's no alt attribute, the important information has just disappeared. So quickly, a lot of people are saying alt tag. Alt technically in HTML is not a tag, it's an attribute. Does it really matter? Well, yes and no. I'm being anal retentive when I insist on talking about alt attribute, but I'm also coming from 20 years of consultation where a lot of people say, well, Nick, I can't find this alt tag reference anywhere on the web. I don't understand it. So if they had looked for alt attribute, they would have found it. So basically how to alt is we have the image tag, we have the source attribute, so whatever image is, and then we have the alt attribute in which we give some description. Sometimes we have the image tag with the source attribute and we leave the alt attribute empty. It's critical to have the alt attribute there, whether we're having a text string in it or not, because we're doing a couple different things with that. Now, I'm going to show you an image and I'm going to ask you something that maybe design folks should do a little bit more, but as a developer, you need to understand this as well. So how would you describe this image if you were to write alternate text for it?
Skiers sitting one ski training.
Is that the broken
Okay,
line?
so we have skiers sitting, we have training. What else could we talk about?
Full screen hero image containing skiers.
Whole screen hero image containing skiers, okay.
It's
What
hard
else?
to tell what's happening with his leg, but I don't know if it's broken or if you had mentioned there's a disabled skier
Okay, so
at center.
So we can mention a disabled skier, but it's not clear what's going on with the leg. What about the three people in the back standing? Is that important to this image?
No.
Not really.
Not really. Okay. What about if we use this image in the context of advertising accessible skiing programs at a resort where it's family fun? So maybe the three people in the back are a family member, and the purpose of the image is to show that this is not just for disabled people. This is for disabled people, their friends and family. Are these three people becoming important?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right. What about the guy standing directly behind the disabled skier in what is actually called a sits key. Is that guy important to describing the image?
Probably, yes. It seems that it's helping.
Okay, he's helping. How is that important, though?
Because you are providing assistance in this facility.
Yeah, okay, you're providing assistance. So we're talking about an instructor behind a disabled skier. So all these answers you've given, it's all correct. It's all good information. We're talking about a disabled skier in a sit ski going down the hill with an instructor behind him, and there are family members, family friends and stuff also taking part in the skiing activity. All that is important information depending on the context. So the context is everything, and it really depends on how you use the image on a page. Now, a quick note, somebody mentioned a hero image. That's probably not critical information to impart when you're looking at it. You don't need to say that it's an image because the screen reader is going to announce it's an image. You probably don't need to say it's the hero image, because what's really important is the information about what's in the image. Now, you could use this photo as part of just decorative, talking about the adaptive skiing program at a ski resort, and this is where it becomes a little bit tricky. We have to decide whether an image is informative or decorative. If the image is informative, that's where we start building alternate text, like we just went through. We have to ask ourselves, what's our context and what's important? The other part of that is this image decorative? Does it actually allow us to just add eye candy? And at that point, do we use an empty or null alt string? It really depends on your context. And there's a wonderful tool called the alt decision tree on the W3C. You don't need to write this. I'm going to give the slides to Tracy to pass on to you later on, so you'll have the reference there. But this tool takes you through question, and depending on how you answer is going to tell you what you should do with your image alternate text. One thing to consider is if you're using the image as the only content in the link, you must have alternate text. You can't leave that string empty. So if you do a link like this, ahref, and then you have an image and you have empty alt text, that basically means when you get there, you have a link. You, as a screen reader user, you know there's a link, but you don't know where it goes. So you want to avoid that. What you want to do instead would be to put alternate text. Now, here I have some code that says ahref, there's an image, and the alt text is skier on a sys key with an instructor behind him. Do you think this is good alternate text for this context?
No.
Why?
Because in this case, the link should be, the image should describe the link, and the link should be clear where it goes.
That's right. So we want to define the destination of the link rather than describing the image itself. You want to avoid duplicate link text. So if you have two links going to the same place that are basically a little bit different, you don't want to do that. What you would want to do instead is, in this case, don't use text, but then you end up with this empty link destination. So you have to move your things around a little bit, and you end up with including the image within the link and then your text as well. And then you have something that is a little bit more solid. It's more CSS to play with when you're building cards like that, but it's going to make things more accessible. There's a whole bunch more we can talk about around images, and we could spend an hour talking about images, like how do we make SVG accessible and that kind of thing. But obviously, we don't have time for that right now. We don't have a whole lot of time left in this session, so I'm going to go quickly through forms. Form element must have labels. Labels are used to determine the purpose of an input. Labels must be specifically associated with input forms. The best way to do that is you use the for attribute, and you can sometimes use an ARIA label attribute if you can't use a visible attribute, but that gets a bit tricky. You may use the ARIA labeled by attribute, but that's just another complication. Wherever possible, use the label element with the for attribute. And in this case, we would use label for email, and then in the input, we use email as the unique ID for that.
Quick question. I read it somewhere that in these cases, when you don't use the for with the label, you can wrap the input inside the label and put the text.
Yes, you can use what is called an implied label. So if you wrap the opening label tag and the closing label tag around the input element, then you can also get that. This is something that you in general should not use. The only place where it's really useful is around checkboxes and radio buttons. But while it's technically correct and it works, I personally prefer to avoid using that because it does create some problem for some screen readers in some speech input devices as well. Give clear instructions. Here's a photo of a shower control that I found at a hotel once, and it was really hard to figure out how to use it, in large part because there's almost no contrast with the instructions. It's also not clear. It relies on understanding of some of the graphics. I'm going quickly through some of this to get to other more juicy things later on. Required fields. Don't notify required fields only with an asterisk. Programmatically hide the asterisk from the screen reader and notify it programmatically. So you would use something like our email field, use a span with ARIA hidden for the asterisk. The reason you do that is because asterisks are pronounced as star for screen reader users, and not everybody understands that, and it adds a lot of cognitive load. What you would want to do is add the ARIA required attribute, and that gives the information for screen reader users. Layout, I'm going to skip. Error messages, make sure they're clearly visible and don't rely on color only. They should be located near the field that has an error, and you should manage the focus. So if you have a submission form, you submit it and you have errors, set focus on the problematic field when you reload the page. Like that, people won't have to navigate the entire page to find the problem. You have to associate them with the field programmatically. So when a screen reader navigates from one field to the next, they will be able to hear the error message. If you're doing validation at the end of a submission and there's more than one errors, just put all the errors in a what's called an error bucket. You put all the errors at the top, and then you can link them to each specific field. If you're doing inline validation, be very, very, very careful not to use that with each character typed. Because if you're doing something like an ARIA live version, or you're checking for each character and someone hasn't even finished typing their email address and it's getting this email address is not valid. And with each new character is this email address is not valid. This email address is not valid. It's going to be very, very tricky. So when you're doing inline validation, instead of implementing that on a per character basis, use the onBlur event. So when they leave the field, that's when you're doing the validation rather than as they're typing. And it's going to make things a lot easier on a lot of people. Timeouts. If you have a form and you must have a timeout, notify users that their session is about to expire, because as we were talking about, if someone is using an on-screen keyboard and has to blink and navigate with their head, it can take a long time to type in. So in general, avoid timeouts. If you're legally mandated, it's a financial form or they're buying something or whatnot, then make sure that when it's about to expire, you give them 2 minutes to extend the timing or let them know. Contrast. I'm going through this quickly. It's stuff it's good for you to know about, but you can look it up a little bit more. As I was saying, gray text on gray background is really bad. When you're working with a design, whether it's someone that's designing it or you're the developer implementing it, there are basically 2 contrast ratios to think about. For regular text, the minimum ratio is 4.5:1. So the foreground color compared to the background color should have a contrast of 4.5:1. You can test that in all kinds of tools. There's web-based tools, there's in Chrome and Firefox, and I think even Safari now, there are contrast checkers in your text inspector. For large text, whether it's, for large text, you're typically thinking 18 point and larger, it's 3:1 contrast, and also for non-text content. So any icon, any things that is on the page that is not text, but we want contrast, you want 3:1 contrast. This can be tricky, but also it's important to remember that not all monitors are calibrated the same. And if you have a factory calibrated design monitor, remember not everyone has that, not everyone is able to use that, and going by the numbers in this case is much better than going by gut feel, but hey, I can see the contrast fine. One things we don't talk about very much is Windows high contrast. A lot of people that have low vision rely on high contrast. One of the things to do to test that is if you're on Windows machine, or if you have a VM and you can load Windows on your Mac or your Linux, enable Windows high contrast. It's easy. Do a search in the search bar for Windows high contrast settings, and you're going to get that. Some of the things to consider is, can you see all the contacts? Can you see the borders around the elements? And can you tell what's going on? Here's on left, a screenshot of the Drupal main page from a few years ago already, and the same screenshot of the same homepage viewed in high contrast. Can you tell me what's missing from the high contrast version?
The menu icon.
Yeah, the hamburger menu icon. So this was triggered in the mobile viewport. They were using an SVG background. No, not an SVG. They were using a background icon for the text, and that was not being displayed in Windows high contrast. Now they fixed it within minutes of me telling them about it. But this is the kind of thing you have to be aware of. Can you see all the elements on your page? So some miscellaneous things. Text resize is super important. You may use your browser to do browser zoom. Command plus will increase the size. Most people that have vision issues and need large text will use text zoom, which is when you're increasing a page without necessarily increase all in the elements, so you're just increasing the text. Is it readable? Is anything truncated? One of the things that happen often is text in the inputs don't resize properly, so it's becoming hard to read. Do you have horizontal scroll? Is your page responsive? Do you have overlaps? Do you have elements that are going to be hiding on top of one another? So you have to look at that. And this is important because very often we're doing things for the mobile device without knowing that users that require 200% resize will often trigger your mobile device. So you can't just think someone is going to get to your mobile device design only on a mobile device. They might actually get there on a browser. Document structure, you want to look at semantics, you want to look at being able to skim the page, you want to look at the heading hierarchy. This is really, really important. Use headings, make sure you don't have skipped headings, because screen reader users, 68% of screen reader users rely on your heading hierarchy to build a mental map of what on the page. So us as sighted user, we can kind of browse and get an idea, whereas screen reader users rely on headings to understand and navigate a page. Links, you must be able to understand a link by itself. Read more and click here links are not useful, so try not to link an entire sentence that makes sense. Language, you want to declare the language of a page. So if your page is in English, in the HTML, you would use HTML lang equals EN. If somewhere on your page you have maybe a skip a language switcher that uses Espanol or Chinese or other language, define that as well, because it's important. The screen reader uses that language declaration in how they announce and speak the content. If you don't define the language of page or part of page, then it will speak the content in the default language of the user's operating system. So maybe this person is Spanish speaking and they interact with the computer in Spanish all the time, but when they get to a web page, if there's no language defined, they're going to read the English as if it was Spanish. And for us, it might be hilarious, but when you're trying to understand what is going on a page, it's going to be really difficult. So we want to avoid doing that. HTML tables. You've surely heard by now that HTML tables are for tabular data, not for layout. Sometimes you may be talking about I'm getting ahead of myself, but sometimes you may be dealing with legacy code where you have HTML that's used for layout, and in that time you want to use the role presentation. So that's going to remove all the information about the number of rows and so on and so forth. HTML tables, I'm coming back to this. You want to include row headers, so you use TH for the column header and the row header, and you want to associate them with row and cells, so you would use the scope attribute, whether it's scope equals cols or scope equals row. Overlays, just quickly, overlays, we have you may have heard of things like accessibility, user ways, and other things. And sometimes you'll see this. It's typically an icon of a man, a white man on a blue circle with his arms and legs spread. And these overlays are tools that websites with one line of code can implement them. And the theory is that it's using AI to make the page more accessible, and then on top of that it gives extra tools. The bottom line is these are snake oil. Don't use them. If you see them somewhere, avoid it. If you have a client that says, hey, let's use that instead of spending the work making the page accessible, don't go there. It's bad. It's actually going to get you sued. And if you want more information, go to overlayfactsheet.com. There's a whole bunch of really important information there about that. Right. Let's talk about why ARIA. Who knows what ARIA stands for? Accessible, rich internet applications. It's a series of role names and values that are added to HTML elements to make them more accessible. Now, ARIA came out before HTML5, so a lot of ARIA is redundant, but there's still a lot of ARIA that we can use to make things more accessible. Y, by the way, stands for the Web Accessibility Initiative, which is an initiative of the W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. I really hate all this alphabet soup. It makes things confusing. But anyway, what's the first rule of ARIA?
If you have to use ARIA, you're doing it wrong.
Yes, something like that. The first rule is don't use it unless it's necessary. So in the vast majority of cases, you can do what you want to do without using ARIA. For example, instead of using div role button tab index equals 0, you can use the button attribute. One thing that is interesting to note is there's an outfit that is running a million report. Basically, they're using automated testing on the first 1 million pages returned from Google. And they noted that of the home pages that had accessibility errors, pages that had ARIA presence averaged 60% more errors than those without. It doesn't mean that ARIA makes things less accessible, but basically it means we're using ARIA in ways that are not going to make things accessible. Semantics versus ARIA, I just talked about button and div. We have a lot of HTML available to us to accomplish what we want. We don't want to change the default behavior. There's a demo there of different variations of button and divs. You can go check it out. Hold on a second. Sorry, I had a phone call coming in. You can go check out the code pen. It's going to give you an idea of the interaction and what's happening with that. ARIA roles, we have a whole bunch of things we can use to improve accessibility. For example, the role search can be added to a search form. So when someone uses a screen reader and they get to that form, they will know, this form is allowing me to search. There's a tooltip attribute that can be used. For example, you could add rule tooltip on a div, but if you do that, keep in mind tooltips are extremely hard to make accessible, so you want to do more than just adding a role tooltip. You can use things like alerts. You can use role of slider. There's a whole bunch of roles you can use to improve accessibility, and I'm gonna let you have fun and research that now that you know that there's these things. We also have properties and states. We can use ARIA required equals true on an input. Now, I said a minute ago, the first rule of ARIA is don't use it unless it's necessary. And you may cleverly think, well, there's the required attribute in HTML5, so I don't need ARIA required. It would be true except for the fact that the required attribute, the HTML5 attribute, has not been implemented really well by browsers and creates some problems. So this is a case where you're using ARIA required equal true. You may use area labeled by, expanded. There's different ways to do that. The last one on this page is ARIA Live, which is used when you want to notify a screen reader users that something has dynamically changed on part of the page. And this is really critical to a lot of what we do in our work, because we do a lot of dynamic stuff. We don't want to reload all pages, but if we're changing only one part of the page, the screen reader hasn't gotten that in their buffer and they won't be able to announce it. So that's where you use an ARIA Live attribute around the content that is changing. There are 3 values to the ARIA Live. The first one is off, and we generally don't use that. It's adding content for nothing. The other one is polite, and this is the one you should use in 99% of cases. ARIA Live polite means it's going to announce whatever has changed on the page after it finished doing its thing. Typical example would be this inline validation we were talking about. So as you type, the screen reader will say the letter you type. If you use ARIA Live polite, it will stop what it's doing when it's done, and then it will announce whatever changed. If you're using ARIA Live assertive, then it's going to stop whatever it's doing and it's going to announce the change. And this can get really obnoxious really fast, and you don't want to do that. So 99% of cases, you rely on ARIA Live polite instead of assertive. And we have just 2 minutes to just wrap up really quickly. I could keep talking about these things. I could go into code samples and CodePen and keep talking, but I think this has given you a good overview of all the things to consider around who needs accessibility, how they need accessibility, what accessibility is, and the kind of things you can look at to make sure what you build is accessible. We were going to talk about advanced accessibility, and really a lot of what I've spoken about really is advanced accessibility. Yes, okay, image alt attribute is a basic and it's been around for 20 years, but the fact is every single audit I do, I have at least 15-20% of issues that I log are around the images. So we all need to walk before we need to learn how to run. And with this information, you'll be able to identify your strengths and your weaknesses, and you have access to tools to build more on that. So I'm done. Thank you for being a good audience. If we can take just a few more minutes, I'm happy to take a few questions or comments. Otherwise, see you on Twitter.
I have one quick question. Can the canvas element in the DOM be accessible? Or is it sort of hidden away and unable to access?
Can the canvas element be made accessible? I'm going to give you my most frustrating answer that I have to use a lot of the time. It depends. It depends on how you're doing it. It depends on who uses it. In theory, you can make it accessible. In practice, there are a lot of hoops to jump through to make it work. I would really suggest exercising your search foo and look a little bit around Canvas accessibility and get answers that way. It's possible, but you're going to spend a lot of time, and if you can do it in different ways, you might save yourself a lot of headache in the long run.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else?
I know there's a bunch of questions in chat that, we probably won't be able to get to all today, but definitely follow Nic on Twitter @BovRoom. He's awesome, amazing, always you're always giving out great advice. So thank you so much for all your hard work there. And you can also hire Nic. Like, we actually hired Nic to do an audit on our website. And it was amazing. So thank you so much, Nic, for doing that. We really, really
My
enjoyed
pleasure.
working with you on that. Yeah.
I'm glad it was helpful.
It really was. It really was. So it's so helpful to, work with accessibility experts and, get second opinions, get first opinions. And Nic, you've always been amazing with all the accessibility questions I have. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Again, follow Nic on Twitter @BobRoom. Ask all the amazing questions that you have there, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.